I know you have expectations that you'll be hearing first my take. I have no take. I come here this morning to celebrate my editor, Said Ali Yaqub, who passed on a year ago under very trying circumstances. And at Love FM in Kumasi, the newsroom has been named after him, Said Ali Yaqub Newsroom, Say Newsroom. We wish him well, and his family, particularly his two daughters, very wonderful daughters. And that brings me to a question about, I'm hearing that some boards that are being constituted don't have a single woman on them. I hope that is not true, because that would be such a sin against even the Constitution. In fact, in the directive principles of state policy, that would be such a sin, and against women as well. Of course, I know you will ask that I do my show often and there are no women on my platform. Yes, I wish that sometimes that sort of energy would direct it rather at the state where we pay our taxes and expect them to do the right things. Thankfully, this morning, we are joined by distinguished panelists who will do more than justice to the issues that we have to discuss this morning. So let me welcome my guest for this morning. You are also to join us by your messages on all our social media platforms. Let us know what you think about portions of the Auditor General's report that you have been reading. Let us know what you think about the President's proclamation that he is committed to the fight against corruption and that his commitment is steadfast. Let's know about that as well. You have followed the GMPC Aka Energy deal and perhaps may have read what Professor Ebo wrote and what Bright Simmons replied him. You may also share your views on those. Thank you very much. My guest this morning, Bright Simmons, is Honorary Vice President, Imani Africa. Thank you for making the time to join us via Zoom, right? Okay. Here in the studio is Oliver Baka Vomawo. He is researcher, University of Cambridge, Faculty of Law. Good morning and welcome to Newsfile.
Thank you.
Right. So first time I'm seeing you face to face in this studio. We are speaking to you all the time via Zoom. Thank you so very much. You bring such, richness to the discussions that we have. Iconoclastic views, and our audiences are excited about them. I'm not just, seeking to flatter you.
Please do flatter me.
Right. Dr. Eric Odro Osai, you have missed him on this show. He's Director General, Internal Audit Agency. That is IAA. You heard me mention earlier that they have indicted the GMPC for its conduct in securing international deals or contracts without the necessary approvals. Doc, thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome.
And Doc has such a rich background that will assist us in discussing the audit report this morning. I'm tired of reading that report. I am sick in the stomach reading that report, because at the end of the day, I tell myself that what I see in that report is enough to get us to stop running to people cup in hand. And we do it every year. The report comes and it shows the sleaze, the graft, and yet it appears nobody suffers for them. Beauty Emefa Nate is Executive Secretary, Ghana Anti-Corruption Coalition. She's joining us via phone. So thank you all so very much for making time this morning. Let's begin by briefly listening to the President, Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo, when he held that meeting with the Ghana Anti-Corruption Coalition.
The highly politicized atmosphere in which many of these allegations are raised in Ghana, in which some of the civil society organizations are are privy to and complicit in, where it's the line between them being independent commentary and being politically related commentary is very, very thin. And in many, many cases, there are lines that are in fact crossed. There are civil society organizations that mounted campaigns to make sure that I did not continue to sit in this seat. I cannot overlook that when I hear them continuing to attack my government and its works, that these were not people who were in any way either objective or sympathetic to what I was doing. So if I tend not to pay too much attention to what they say, I don't know. For myself, I think that a lot of objective people would appreciate the position that I take. I think we're all aware of the circumstances in which the first Auditor, when I say the first Auditor General in my time left office. It seemed to presage some disputation between him and my government, between him and myself, and somebody had to act in his place. I felt that it was important that that person should be given sufficient time to develop the confidence of the population, rather than to rush to an appointment which could also have given the impression that that is the reason why we acted against the first Auditor General, to remove him from office and plant somebody perhaps more pliant or more accessible. I believe the one who was succeeded him, who came to succeed him by natural order in the hierarchy there, has not demonstrated sufficient quality, independence of view. For instance, he's responsible for something that is unheard of in our history, the 12 statutory reports that have to be compiled and placed before Parliament.
Described it as
a personal price to pay for corruption by speeding up the investigation and prosecution of corruption cases, as well as asset recovery of proceeds of corruption. However, we will have to be more radical in our efforts to achieve results in the short term if Ghana is to deliver a big blow against corruption. As demonstrated by the 2019 Afrobarometer Corruption Survey, public approval ratings of government's efforts at fighting corruption have waned. Therefore, Mr. President, you and your appointees must prioritize measures that will contribute to a restoration of public confidence in the commitment and dedication of you and your team's effort to fight corruption. One way to demonstrate this is to lead by example and refrain from profligacy while applying sanctions to appointees who fall foul of the law.
Right. So the anti-corruption, campaigners met with the president, and their message is, in summary, what you heard the representative read, that the corruption perception surveys over the period, it doesn't look good, and therefore they called on the president to do something about it and get his appointees also to set up. And you heard some portion of the president's response. Let's first hear from Beauty Emefa Nate, who is the Executive Secretary of the Ghana Anti-Corruption Coalition. Thank you very much for joining us this morning, madam. Kindly unmute your microphone. All right. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great. Good to have you. Why was this necessary in the first place?
Okay, thank you so much, Samson. I'd like to first greet your audience and thank you for the opportunity that you have given us. Our motivation to meet with the president stemmed from our concerns, evidence from our work on the ground, because we believe that the fight against corruption should be a concern to every Ghanaian. And looking at the data, we realize that there is the need to draw the president's attention so that the necessary measures will be urgently taken. So the forum that the president provided was a forum for a candid dialogue, especially given the creeping normalization of corruption that becomes a threat to our development aspirations, especially the president's agenda of moving Ghana beyond aid. So that was why we met with the president to reflect the data that is not speaking so well about the state of Ghana's fight against corruption, and also elicit his support in terms of addressing them.
So yeah, we have read your report. I think the Afrobarometer report the last time. Give credence to what you just said, the creeping normalization of corruption, where a majority of the people were aware of the corruption and yet suggested that they were scared to even report or speak about it because they will suffer some reprisal. Whilst corruption was heavy, it wasn't their topmost priority issue that they needed resolved. And so you came to the conclusion, as in the anti-corruption body, that there was a dangerous creeping normalization of corruption. So you tell him about it, and so what?
Okay, so before the and so what question, just to highlight some of the concerns that we raised. So we looked at the Corruption Perception Index, which is churned out by Transparency International every year. So we look at the 10 years data. And something, the unfortunate issue is that we have never been able to score above the average mark for this 10 years. And the other unfortunate issue is that our highest score within this 10 years has been in 2014, which was 48. And the lowest score we had was in 2017, which is 40. So if you have the graph and look at 2012 to 2020, what it means is that we have not been able to even sustain the earlier gains we made. And so the picture presents a stagnation in our fight against corruption. That notwithstanding, you talked about the Afrobarometer. The Afrobarometer results or survey is also indicating that the citizens' approval ratings for government's anti-corruption efforts declined sharply since 2017, which is where we had our lowest corruption perception survey. And unfortunately, before 2017, citizens had a lot of hope for the president to be able to tackle corruption. So if there's that sharp decline, one, we believe that is something that needs urgent attention. And then why, in response to your and so what question, has to do with the fact that the president, if you recall, when he went for the bar conference or so, talked about the kind of investment he has made in the resources allocation. And he even repeated same when we met with him in terms of the investment that he's doing in terms of supporting the fight against corruption. Our worry is that if we are actually putting in a lot of resources and the data we have is not consistent with the resources being pushed into the fight against corruption, then every Ghanaian should be worried. And that is why we feel that questions should be asked. Are the resources being used to effectively support the work that should be done? Are the resources, even the strategy for the resources that are they in consonance with, for instance, the National Anti-Corruption Action Plan, which is the Ghana's 10-year anti-corruption strategy we adopted in 2014. So if the National Anti-Corruption Action Plan we agreed on a holistic approach to the fight against corruption, if we are effectively supporting that with resources, are we implementing it as the NACAP suggested? And if not, why? And if yes, why are we not getting the needed results? So these are questions that we believe need every Ghanaian to be interested in, and also for the president to ask and reflect on, so that we can, if it is a matter of reflection, it will help us to identify the shortcomings and re-strategize, so we can have the benefits of the resources being invested.
I'll return to ask what your answer to these questions, more importantly, the question about the resources, there not being a certain commensurate reflection of what the resources that are being said to be pumped into these organizations, is able to produce. But briefly, how did you take the president's response? What he told you was that his commitment is steadfast, even though he has issues with some of the entities also because they are partisan, and feels that CSOs were not happy to see him come back to office.
Okay.
As in win elections, yeah.
Yeah, so in regards to his response regarding his fight against corruption, he is also saying it from his perspective, but we also believe that he will reflect on the data that we handed to him, and we believe that he would look at the issue critically. And because, why am I saying this? The president has encouraged that we should have more of this discussion, where we could then look at the issues. So his response may just be a defensive response to the reaction of the data presented to him. But I believe that the president, in good faith, would look at the data, because I don't think the president would want to waste the nation's resources. So he would want to look at the data. And with regards to the issue, okay, so even the data, let me just draw attention to another data that we presented to him, which is the Auditor General's report. And if you look at the irregularities presented and the amount of money that has been listed as part of the irregularities, especially for the previous years, compared to 2020, the amount has more than doubled. So that is worrying, because if you previously had about 6 million, and now the current report is talking about 12 million, if I got it right, let's say 12 billion, sorry, I think 12 billion. Then you should be worried that if this report it means that there's some increase, a high jump from the previous audit reports results. So that is why we believe that the president will necessarily has to do something about this. In relation to the attack on CSOs, something I would like to say that this is not so new from my experience. CSOs over the years have always been branded by government. Perhaps this came because it came on the platform when the president was engaging directly with CSOs. But we've had governments always thinking CSOs are out to do do things that may not be in their favor. But interestingly, something, the data or the trend also shows that when these governments are in opposition, suddenly it's the same resources that CSO churn out that these same parties in opposition use for their political campaign or to seek political advantage in terms of the information that we churn out. So I don't think this is new, but I can confidently speak for the Ghana Anti-Corruption Coalition and our members and the partners we engage in, that any resource or information we put out there, it is holding government to account. And we can only hold government to account. We cannot, because government is managing the resources of the country. So the issues we raise has to do with budget, has to do with conflicts of interest issue, has to do with how our resources are managed effectively and efficiently to the benefit of every citizen. And this information we always put out, which every Ghanaian can just go and look at the information. And we have been consistent in holding government to account. And I must say something that, interestingly, it's on record that the NDC has always accused CSOs of not being too harsh on them compared to the MPP government. So for me, it is good. It only shows that we are doing our work. It only shows that we are holding duty bearers to account for what they are entrusted with.
Right. Bright Simmons joins us. Thank you very much, Bright, for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Samson.
Great. So to start with, the issue of the danger of the creeping normalization of corruption, which brings the CSOs to decide that we need to sit down with the president. Perhaps he is not aware of what is going on, so that we can inform him to get him to reflect and to think what to do. Professor Jima Bwedi said not long ago, when Domelevo was removed from office, he said, quote, Mr. Domelevo was exercising proper constitutional and legal oversight over officials and institutions that Mr. Domelevo has sought to hold to account. The man was doing his best to protect the public purse. That's the mantra of the president. He came in to protect the public purse. There are many who say he's the biggest beneficiary of CSO's work, particularly in respect of corruption, CSOs and the media. Now, he says that the man was doing his best to protect the public purse, to claim surcharges for improperly spent public funds. One who is trying to fight corruption is one who is being persecuted and hounded out of office. Now, my interest is in the conclusion. He says, as for the president's credibility in terms of anti-corruption, I am afraid to say it is in tatters. It has been in tatters for a while, but this puts the nail in the coffin. I see Mr. Domelevo as a victim of well-orchestrated actions by individuals who are government officials and by state institutions. So, do you agree with Professor Jima Bwedi and therefore take the president's claim with a pinch of salt?
Well, I wouldn't frame my reaction in the same way that you have, but certainly, as far as the Afrobarometer results are concerned, the president ought to be worried if perceptions about corruption at the presidency has grown from 37% thereabout of Ghanaians believing that officials at the presidency are corrupt to as many as 78% of Ghanaians believing that officials at the presidency are corrupt over that period, from 2002 till the latest survey. So that certainly established the basis upon which CSOs will visit the president and seek to find out if he shares the concerns that CSOs have about this sudden or increasing spike in public discontent and public, I say, distrust in the degree to which the president is fighting corruption. I have my own issues that the corruption matter is one that perhaps we will have to narrow down to specific sectors in order to be able to deal conclusively with it. And I guess I'll take your lead in that respect.
What do you make of his comments about CSOs? Some say, well, this is not new. In 2018, he launched an attack on the CSOs, and they have become familiar with a sitting president attacking CSOs.
Well, that's surprising, given the fact that the president's own party has been a very prolific user of CSO-type engagements with the political space in Ghana. I mean, Let My Vote Count, Alliance for Accountable Governance. The president's party is one of the well-known pioneers for setting up politically aligned think tanks like the Dankwa Institute. It dates back even before the transition into multi-party rule with the Young Elephants Club and a whole bunch of civil society type engagements. So if the president all of a sudden feels uncomfortable about the work of the CSOs, I'll presume that that is because in some instances, those activities are not aligned with his political interest. And it's natural to expect that a political actor will not be too happy if there are other actors that, are hell-bent on putting his government under strict scrutiny, some of which might have political costs. So we're not that surprised. We just don't believe that he's sincere in his concern about CSOs, given the history as I've just narrated it. We just think that it's understandable that if CSOs and others of that ilk are undertaking activities that perhaps could have significant political cost for the president's party, it's natural that we will expect him to fight back.
You just spoke about, or gave us a list of some CSOs that are clearly established by political parties or political party or people who are politically exposed. And so is the president wrong when he says some of these CSOs are partisan? And I suppose we know that some of them are partisan. Some of them are just set up to do political propaganda.
That's the actual CSO activity. We always warn people to be very careful in the way that they characterize the civil society movement in Ghana. There are maybe 50,000 or so CSOs. The vast majority of them are community-based organizations focused on voluntary initiatives at the grassroots level, helping young people get a step on their foot on the ladder, the employment ladder. A bunch of them are involved in cooperative-type economic activity. We have CSOs that are primarily hometown associations. There's a wide diversity of CSOs. Within that very broad spectrum, maybe 1% of them are politically active. And of the 1% that are politically active, the vast majority of them are still locally focused. So when it comes to nationally focused, politically active CSOs, we're talking about a very minute fraction of CSOs in this country. I'm not sure that when the president has concerns about CSOs, he has a concern about the 99% of CSOs that are generally community focused. He perhaps has concerns about CSOs that impact on the political landscape. And now the concern we have to have is that unless we're completely convinced that just because someone has been elected to represent specific interests, because it's a majoritarian process, and if you do a ranking, very often you are voting for someone because that's who is on the ballot, and in comparison with others on the ballot, this is the only one that perhaps is your least unfavorable candidate. So a lot of the time, we don't vote necessarily because the president we are voting for is completely representative of all our interests. Given that fact, the nature of the democratic game is such that you have a lot of suboptimal representation. A lot of people may not, believe that their MPs are sufficiently capable of representing all their interests. CSOs fill in that gap. So unless you are not a Democrat, unless you don't understand democratic participation, it will be very difficult with a straight face to hold that CSOs do not contribute remarkably, do not contribute extraordinarily to the progress of our democracy and to the quality of our democratic institutions. Which is why I say that the president was performing for an audience. His petition, they mount the platform, they perform, we things on them sometimes. And in that regard, we perhaps should not put too much store on what he says when, clearly he's performing for an audience.
All right. Well, we know the president relied heavily on Imani's work ahead of the elections, as in the election that brought him to power, and also work by Ghana Anti-Corruption Coalition and the rest of them. Of course, we know the other so-called CSOs that only, come alive when a party is in opposition, when the party they associate with is in opposition. Now, Baka, he says that he will continue to listen to divergent views despite the efforts to thwart his re-election bid. What sense do you get from that?
I think that one of the things that happens very often is that when you have a president who has clearly declared an intention to say that, well, the vast majority of what CSOs are saying is calculated at elections and trying to get me unelected, then the framework of analyzing the problem and discussing it is on an electoral timetable. And that's one of the biggest questions I've had always in terms of how policy is decided and ways in which we think about problems. That every time we introduce the electoral cycle into the conversation, anytime anything is said and we fall back into, do I want to get elected or not get elected, we would definitely not be able to do justice to the problem. So that's one of the challenges here. But secondly, the president goes on to say, well, because all of them are this way, I have decided that I'm not going to listen to them. And that is very dangerous, where the president himself says on record that I have decided that I'm not going to even take anything out of substance of it, irrespective of the divergent voices. Because even those who are mobilized and political as well, we say even a broken clock is right twice in a day. That there must be something that comes out of what you're saying that the president can engage with and find some benefit out of. It is the whole essence of why we're always talking about bipartisan approaches. Because we do find merit in the partisan back and forth, that it could something produce out of that. So that's where my bigger concern, I would say, is. But the president goes on and talks about, his own successes and all of that. And a lot of times I say, when we are being invited to analyze sort of a governance record on corruption, I wonder by what metric or benchmarks we want to be able to enter the conversation with. Because a lot of times it's very low on that substance. And what we do is that naturally we all defer then to anecdotal accounts, right? And the challenge with anecdotal accounts is that they are often dramatized single stories or single news items that we use as representative of the entirety of what the issues is. So for instance, in the Mahama administration, we would go quickly refer to Woyome, we would quickly refer to Bas Brandon, then Ford Saga, and that becomes seen as some totality of the failure on corruption. In this government, then we talk about the Ijapa, we are talking about the Boss contamination scandal, we are talking about those instances then, while they do well in magnifying our perception of the problem, they do not give us the tools or the answers to be able to see the full range of the process and structure-driven corruption. So that's kind of where I want to take my attention to, in this conversation. Right. Now, for instance, the president has given us, in his conversation, 2 benchmarks by which we should assess his record on corruption. The first one relates to the creation of bureaucracies. So a lot has been made about the creation of the Office of the Special Prosecutor, which for some translates as some reflection or translation of a commitment to fight corruption. That's the first thing. The second one is about resourcing, and we have to engage with that a bit more. So let me start with the first one, which is about the creation of bureaucracies. If bureaucracies, or just the mere fact of the creation of a bureaucracy, is the winning the fight against corruption, then I think we're giving all politicians a pass. because that is happening. I mean, the Mills administration created YOCO out of the Serious Fraud Office, you know, and we can always go back and find instances where governments are quick to create bureaucracies, which then everybody's invited to appreciate and applaud. And then we never really get into the questions about, but what has that produced? And I think for the Special Prosecutor's Office in particular, we can all attest to the fact that, well, very little has come out of that so far. In terms of the resourcing, and it's a point that, you know, BT, MFNAT makes as well, and really puts the screws on that question. And I've taken a bit of time to listen to the president on this, because the president in his talking mentions specifically, you know, YOCO, he mentions specifically, I think Shraj, he mentions the police, as some of the institutions which have been resourced, in Parliament as well, as, you know, to help the fight in corruption. So I decided that, well, a lot of what we don't do often is, you know, let's look at the numbers and see whether or not there is, in fact, that resourcing jump that the president is talking about. So I went back to the last thing the Mahama administration did, which was the 2015 Appropriations Act, which was supposed to prepare us for 2016. And in that, and I decided to not look at the Ghana cedi figures, but translate it into what the dollar rate at the time by the Bank of Ghana was as a benchmark, because I'm unable to account them for inflation and other things. So let's use the dollar value of the money that was given to Parliament under both administrations. So we know, for instance, that in the 2015 Appropriations Act, $67.5 million, based on the dollar rate at 31st December 2015, which is 3.7931, this Bank of Ghana dollar rate, was what was given to Parliament. Then in 2020, which is for 2021, 90.9 million was given to Parliament. So immediately you say, well, there's a 23.4 million increase that has been given to Parliament. But in fact, what we forget is one thing. One, the Parliament threatened to withhold the veto on the appropriations bill because it had been reduced by 20 million. So that money itself, Parliament had to fight for. And so there was no systematic program in saying that we're targeting corruption and we're going to do more, and that you need this resourcing to do that. Secondly, the bulk of that money goes to CAPEX, which is capital expenditure. So there's no direct increase in the budgetary allocations that are corruption specific. And so if we then say that, we can't extrapolate then from even the jump there and say there's an intentional attempt to centralize corruption as part of resources in Parliament. The president talks of Shraj. Now, in the 2016 or 2015 Appropriations Act, you have $8 million, again at the same Bank of Ghana rates then, given to Shraj. The president, for 2020, based on the 5.753 of Bank of Ghana, you have again $8 million which is given to Shraj. No change has been given in terms of the receipts that Shraj gets. So I decided that, well, maybe the president is talking about something else that I'm not noticing. So I decided to go down to the breakdown, which is the budgetary allocation that are specific to corruption fighting under Shraj. Now, in 2016, we gave $551,000 for Shraj's anti-corruption work. And in 2021, we budgeted $566,721, which is $15,000 more. This is the significant resources we have been advised to, we have been invited to engage in. Let's take YOCO. Again, one of the institutions that the president mentions. And the sector minister for YOCO is the Minister for Justice. And usually the budget for YOCO, I then find that is given to them under a heading called Management on Economic and Organized Crime to the Minister of Justice. And in 2015, for 2016, we gave $2.1 million based on the rates there. And now we've given them $3.4 million. So there's a $1.4 million difference. Again, the devil is in the detail. When you look at it, you see that the real changes are capital expenditure and money budgeted for procurement of goods and services. And when you go back to the source document, it's mostly new vehicles. So that's, again, we are being invited and told that the president is doing significant resourcing here. And I'm showing that I do not see this being accounted for in the numbers. For the police, now, under the current Appropriations Act, there's no specific indication of how much money was given to the police. But we know that under the former one, there's a breakdown for what is given to the police, which is under the 2016 one. But what we do know that all of them come under the Ministry of Interior budget. And the Ministry of Interior budget for 2020, 2021 is $6.5 million. The Minister of Interior budget for the 2016 was 8.3 million. So there's about 27% decrease, in fact, in allocations to the Ministry of Interior. So it is very difficult for me then to see where the resourcing conversation is coming from. But beyond that, one of the things I'm very apprehensive about is tying ourselves with the shoestring that the president has provided, and then for which reason we fail to account for all the other things which we need to look at. But one of the bigger problems about the way in which the conversation around corruption is always talked about is that we are very focused on the input-based process rather than the output. So what are we putting in and what are we getting out of it? I mean, in terms of the resourcing, I've shown that, well, we haven't done significantly different. But what has been different is that we've created a new bureaucracy, which is the Office of the Special Prosecutor, which, if you listen to the vetting of the new Special Prosecutor, you can tell that there's significant structural problems that already exist in the body of that institution. And I do wish him the best of luck. But even on that, and the resourcing for that, because it didn't exist under the Mahama administration, more money was given to it under the previous act than is being proposed for it this year round. So again, even on the input base, we're not getting it. And the output, we're not seeing anything really different. But fundamentally for me, one of the big gambles of our democracy, and in our democratic institution, is that the practice of democracy will create some sort of aversion to corruption and corrupt dealing. And that is why when you take all metrics by which corruption is accounted for, and you compare them against institutions or societies which are more democratic, you'll see that there's a direct correlation between the more democratic you are, the better you are doing on corruption. For Ghana, unfortunately, the inverse is true. That even though the metrics claim that we are doing better on democracy, corruption is getting worse. So which shows that perhaps corruption itself is endemic and related to the democratic process itself. So whether it's campaign financing, like the last election, you see people who on TV displaying amounts of money they have been giving or bags of food and all of that, we see that we don't do anything about. So the practice of democracy itself has made corruption endemic. And that is why it is not, unnatural to me to hear the CSO talk about creeping normalization. And I would say entrenchment itself of corruption because it's directly related to our democratic processes.
Dr. Odrosai, you have been watching, normally you watch the figures to tell the story whether we are doing well or not in respect of how the audits are going. Well, in our Constitution in Article 35, Clause 8, is an injunction on all, governments. It says the state shall is mandatory, shall take steps to eradicate corrupt practices and the abuse of power. When you take the president's response to what they told him and what they expect of him, how do you analyze his comments?
Thank you very much, Samson. And let me say good morning to your listeners and viewers. Samson, let me also help in the discussions, especially my brother has come out with a number of data. But let me also mention that IOCO, SHRAJ, and the police are not the only institutions fighting corruption in this country. We have the Internal Audit Agency, we have the Ghana Audit Service, we have the Financial Intelligence Center, all of them fighting corruption. Let me also mention that when budgets are allocated to institutions to fight corruption, they are to deliver on their mandate. And that is where I always fault people. If you want to look at only the figures without doing a performance audit on how the people deliver on their mandate or institutions deliver on their mandate, you get it wrong. Because he introduced the input-output analysis. If funds are given to deliver on a mandate, check whether the mandate has been delivered according to law. And that is where I would invite all Ghanaians to also look at the performance audit. Let me also make the statement that financing capital expenditure is a critical function or a critical component of the expenditure of anti-corruption institutions. Because if you don't have the vehicle, you cannot move. If you don't have the infrastructure, you cannot move. And we would all agree that the OSP, the previous special prosecutor, indicated that even the structure they gave to him was not good to enable him function. So financing CAPEX is key. So when my brother mentioned that majority of the funds that went to SHRAJ, for instance, went into CAPEX, and for that matter, he thinks that it is not directly related to fighting corruption, I would disagree with him. From where I sit, I think financing capital expenditure is critical for the work of the anti-corruption institution. Let me come to the substantive statement made by the president. I think that the president was being defensive. Once you attack a politician, you expect a politician to defend himself. But I see the fight against corruption in a number of ways. And since I became the Director General of Internal Audit Agency, I realized that we've gotten it wrong as a country. We always use the post approach to fight corruption instead of adopting a preventive approach. To fight corruption, you need laws, you need policies, you need institutions, and then you need the ability and the willingness to implement the laws and get these institutions to deliver on their mandate.
Which one of all these items don't we have?
We do not have the willingness to get the institutions to deliver on their mandate. And we have some group of indisciplined people who are managing state institutions who have made it their mind that they will not respect the laws of this country. And that is where I have the problem. We don't have a problem with laws. We don't have a problem with the structures. Our problem is how to implement the laws and get people to be on their feet. Cracking the whip is the challenge of the Republic of Ghana. Look at the Auditor General's report, and I will share some data. And I am not surprised about the report the Auditor General submitted about certain institutions, because at the internal audit level, the internal auditors have raised these issues time and again. We have written to them, we have engaged them, except that they've closed their eyes. And the challenge we have is that the internal auditors cannot act, because the Internal Audit Agency Act itself is obsolete and it ties the hands of internal auditors. So I think if we want to win the fight against corruption, and the president wants to make a lot of inroads by way of fighting corruption, we should adopt the preventive approach and crack the whip. Samson, let me come to the corruption perception data I have here. The corruption perception data, contrary to what I'm hearing, from 2017 to 2020, we have been improving. 2017 was 40, 2018 41, 2019 41, 2020 we moved to 43. I must admit that the highest all-time score was in 2014. We have never crossed 50, which is a problem for all of us. But to be able to resolve this issue, I think we should be more biting. And that is where my challenge is. The leaders of this country must crack the whip and be biting. The laws that are obsolete must be amended. Because if we are not very careful, we'll pump money into these institutions, we don't do performance audit, and we'll all be looking at the figures. We ask ourselves, what is the mandate of IOCO? What are they supposed to do? What have they done in the year towards fighting corruption? We have a National Anti-Corruption Action Plan. This action plan has been costed. It is being implemented on an annual basis. We need annual progress report. Who is aligning this to the monies or the funds that are injected into these activities? So I think that, look, we don't have a problem with laws. We don't have a problem with structures. We need to cultivate the habit and have the willingness to crack the whips and get people to do the right things. That's all.
The Afrobarometer survey that we refer to.
No, that's the Corruption Perception Index.
Corruption Perception Index.
Yes.
I'm talking about Afrobarometer, CDD champion.
The CDD Afrobarometer.
Spoke about, among other things, that corruption is somewhat a lot worse. And even though corruption ranked 8th, it was not a priority of the problems of Ghanaians. And this is where they came to the conclusion that we are getting to normalization of corruption, where people see the corruption, but they don't feel that bothered again. Do you think that feeds into the reactions that you get from public officers when the question of corruption is raised, particularly from politicians?
I think I want to agree with that perception, but it also boils down to, again, a leadership. If people think that corruption is normal in a country like Ghana, I can dip my hand in it, use the money to do anything, and nobody can do anything to me, then gradually we are institutionalizing it. And when we get to that level, then it means there's a failure of
this is 2019, just 2019.
Yes.
And the report said that 6 in 10 Ghanaians, that's 61% of Ghanaians, say that they will not report corruption for fear of some form of retaliation?
It means it's a failure of state institutions. Because if you have to blow the whistle, we have the Whistleblowers Act, and you have to blow the whistle, and you are double sure that if I blow the whistle, my identity will be covered, action will be taken. People will be motivated to blow the whistle. But if people have this perception and impression that even when I blow the whistle, they will blow my cover and no action will be taken, nobody will report.
Does this fear come from the posture of the political leadership, or it does not?
I think it's does not, because the political leadership do not implement the law. You see, I think we have to separate political leadership from the technical administrative leaders who implement these laws. For instance, the Whistleblowers Act. The Whistleblowers Act is implemented by an institution. Yoko has an act. So assuming somebody reports a case to Yoko, Yoko investigates, and Yoko has the mandate to take them to court. Unless maybe the AG comes in with the nolle prosequi, the Yoko can proceed. So that is where maybe I agree with you on the political bit. But let Yoko take the steps and let all Ghanaians see that the political leadership has interfered or intervened and prevented Yoko from delivering on its mandate. Certain state institutions are just not delivering on their mandate. And I think those are the institutions we should put on their toes. The political leadership can be a problem. But in most cases, if you, the posture of the leader of that institution, is such that, look, it's a no-no. I can't imagine the Internal Audit Agency undertaking an investigation, having their report, send the report to Yoko to prosecute, and Yoko comes out to say that they will not. No, they have never done that to us.
I'm going to Beauty to give us her final, input, and then she takes leave of us as we move to the next issues. But I discovered that you were noting something when he was writing, when I asked the question about the posture of political leadership, whether it informs how people want to, act or not act. What's your view on that?
I find the sort of the limitation to the conversation as to why persons will be apprehensive to do more, to nolle prosequi, has been very limiting. And it's surprising to me because you talked about 6 out of 10 Ghanaians saying that they will not report. I've worked in the public sector. I think the number will be as high as 9 would not report because of fear of victimization. And the reason is simple. The few instances where we see somebody stick their neck out, their neck gets chopped. Daniel Domolevo talked about something, about the number of people who worked on that deal with him, where they were transferred, demoted, and others and handed out of office. That sends a clear signal as to what the civil service ought to conduct itself. That if this gives you an indication that this was what would happen, there's no way you do more than your perfunctory work and then walk home and don't get involved in anything. And it happens so many other instances where, for instance, you have talked about internal audit, where they may push this conversation, but there's a limit to how you go because you are fearful of what the reprisals would be.
We are not fearful. Now, we are constrained by our law.
Now the fear of reprisals that comes from the top down is translated from how politicians generally treat the civil service. For which reasons, even at the directorate level, they feel themselves as enforcers of what politicians' mind sensitivities downstream. Because they themselves are worried about what kind of blowbacks they're going to get. And so for which reason they send that messaging down. And as a young person who joins the civil service, your first reaction is walk away. You don't want to deal with this. And I think that is where this will become an entrenched way in which we won't get the institutions to push.
Now, BT, listening to the two of my guests in the studio, Dr. Eric Odrosai and Oliver Vomawo, what do you make of this fear, and as confirmed by the Afrobarometer report 2019, that 6 in 10 Ghanaians will rather prefer, 61%, will rather prefer not to talk about it because they fear they'll get trouble. What do you make of that in the midst of we having a law? The Whistleblowers Act, both my guests here have just mentioned it. The Whistleblowers Act was passed in 2006. It is supposed to provide more than sufficient protection, including state security. And also, it is to provide protection against harassment Becca mentioned victimization in the public service. It is so to protect you against victimization. And in fact, for the generality of the public and anybody who blows the whistle, if you blow the whistle and it leads to a certain success, you are entitled to as much as 10% of the proceeds of the thing you blow the whistle on. This is such an incentive, and yet you have 61% of the people being scared and not wanting to do anything when they hear about corruption. What could be the problem leading to the normalization of corruption?
Thank you very much, Samson. So that still brings us back to the issue of the NACAP, which is the National Anti-Corruption Action Plan, where we adopted a holistic approach for fighting corruption. And we also looked at 3 strategies that we have to adopt, which is the prevention strategy that Dr. Addo alluded to. We also admitted that it's important to also do education and sensitization so that citizens will know and also understand the effects and impacts of corruption on their lives. And the third strategy has to be with enforcement, which has to do with investigation and prosecution. But as you rightly said, and this data is even also confirmed by some research that the Ghana Anti-Corruption Coalition with partner organizations did regarding citizens' perception and their knowledge and experiences of fighting corruption, on corruption. And it doesn't speak well to the reality of our fight against corruption. Why am I saying that? Citizens continue to perceive corruption as something that is an entitlement. So when I'm gaining from it, it is good. When I'm not gaining from it, it is bad. And that is why issues of conflict of interest were not seen as corruption behavior when we did our study. Issues of nepotism have been accepted as something that Ghanaians, opportunities. So if I have a minister in power and I can get him to circumvent the due process to my advantage, then it is good. But all these are effects, or these actually lead us to corruption. Once we don't see anything wrong with conflict of interest, once we don't see anything wrong with nepotism, once we don't see anything wrong with issues that should draw attention as citizens of corruption, then it means that we are normalizing it and we are accepting it as normal behavior. With regards to the witness whistleblower, we also have the Witness Protection Law, which even has given additional support to whistleblowers. But something, the reality on the ground, the Ghana Anti-Corruption has invested a lot of energy on getting citizens to understand the whistleblowing. We even have produced simplified guides on the act so that citizens will have a basic understanding of the whistleblowing. And I would like to tell you that some of the issues were confronted in the field. One, when the institutions that citizens have to even report to, these are the same institutions that some of the institutions that the Afrobarometer is saying that citizens do not trust. So, for instance, one of the closest institutions that citizens will report to will be the police. But when people go to the police station, from the data we have gathered, they are not even told, or they are not even given the option that we can report as a whistleblower. Because in reporting a complaint, you have to report under the whistleblowing or report as a normal complaint. So they end up reporting as normal complaint. And that is why then getting into the process, they realize that, no, that was not what their intention is. It's also because even the people who are receiving the complaints they do not even understand or are not they do not have the appreciation of what the whistleblower is.
Or
and
sometimes they have blown the cover of the blowers.
Exactly.
And
in fact,
they have put them in harm's way.
Exactly.
That was the second
thing I was even coming to. So secondly, people also told us that when they report, there's a compromise. So they are rather reported to the people that they reported, and the cover is blown. And for some time, from the field data that we have, citizens have felt more comfortable reporting to the media than to go to all these institutions, because they thought that once they put it out into the media space, it's better. So that means that we need to have a lot to do to have citizens' appreciation of the effects of corruption.
Right.
If citizens do not see it, there is nothing we will do that would let them appreciate that corruption is a collective fight and each person has to play a role.
So back to that same important question I asked you. What is the place of political pronouncements to encouraging the citizens or discouraging them? In 30 seconds, if you can respond to that.
So the political pronouncements are not just words. They should be action. They should demonstrate action to say that when I talk about zero tolerance to corruption, this is exactly what I mean. And when political utterances do not seem to portray that if somebody has not, like, let me just use the current issue about the health minister, where the defense has been that because he has not personally benefited from the transaction, he is not corrupt. But clearly, the breaches have been documented, procurement breaches have been documented. When you take the Financial Management Act, it has also been breached. So, and these are documented evidence of those breaches, which the minister himself has admitted to. So where lies the fact that if all these are breached and the presidency is saying that, oh, because of the COVID situation, because the minister has a good intention, so we must sympathize with him, then that becomes a miscommunicated issue to the citizen, because then citizens are having missed information. So when we say, no, you don't have to breach the procurement rules, you don't have to breach the financial management rules, and then somebody breach and we can sympathize in one context and in another context we don't, then it confuses the citizen.
Okay.
And it also provides justification to also citizens to say that if this is done or accepted behavior in this particular context, then I could also justify my action in a particular context. So what we are saying is that we should not justify corruption in any way. Once rules are breached, we have to apply the sanction. And it's also important.
So this kind of conduct, you will say, is the reason we are not seeing the money as in reflect the actions. So there's no, the output doesn't reflect how much we say we are putting into these entities. Beauty, I want to thank you so very much for making time to join us this morning. Beauty Emefa Nate is with the Ghana Anti-Corruption Coalition, and they had a meeting with the president, as you have understood from her, to let the president know of the circumstance of the fear and the danger of the normalization of corruption. And the president had his responses. So Beauty is the executive secretary of the Ghana Anti-Corruption Coalition. I will get my last word, I suppose, from Bright Simmons, so that we take a break and return to continue with the other issues. Now, Bright, everybody is talking the law and all of that, but Beauty brings a certain face to the law and how it is applied. And we have heard Charlotte Osei say in this week that if you decide to discriminate how you apply the law, then you'll have a problem on your hands. We have the Whistleblowers Act. The law requires that there should be a fund set up to compensate people who blow the whistle. 15 years on, that fund has not been set up. Then in 2019, we add onto that law, Witness Protection Act. The protections that law, the 2006 law, is supposed to give to whistleblowers, already they don't get. Then we add onto that law. So where are we going?
I want to take an issue with the comment that Dr. Sai made about the fact that, it's not high-level political leadership that is amiss in this matter, and it's rather, heads of technical and administrative agencies that we should focus our energies on. I think that's not correct. I mean, if tone at the top is not top-notch, not to stretch the metaphor, if tone at the top is not top-notch, you're going to have challenges trying to enforce discipline down the line. We've had situations where in the natural resource sector, for instance, Ghana has been a perennial underperformer. I mean, look at this issue around the timber legality assurance framework we've been trying to do for 10 years. Look at this issue around Galamsey. And you say, well, we've got administrative and technical agencies that are responsible, Mineral Commission and the rest. And yet still, when the political leadership needed to crack the whip and took matters into their own hand, we saw the minister responsible for the Interministerial Committee write to the CID suggesting that high-level political functionaries, leaders of the president's own political party, are implicated in a plot to take seized mining equipment and sell them in the open market or use them in the industry. And to date, there's not been an investigation of this gentleman that has led to any clear results, and the president is not able to step down on the matter and ensure that we get results. In those circumstances, how are you going to be able to ensure that somebody at the Minerals Commission does their work? In January of 2021, a multimedia investigation revealed that despite claims that soldiers were being withdrawn from Operation Vanguard, from Galamstop and the like, the truth is some of these soldiers were involved in providing protection. They were running protection rackets to the benefit of illegal miners in Manso Forest. That investigation had audiovisual evidence. To date, not a single senior officer of the Ghana Armed Forces has been held accountable for the actions of these soldiers and other members of the security forces who evidence widely suggests are implicated in illegal mining in this country. We've had situations where the Presidential Committee on National Resources, has been caught on camera facilitating bribes, more or less within the premises of the presidency itself. No action has been taken that is conclusive enough to suggest that the president has a zero tolerance for corruption in these matters. So there's a long catalogue of situations in the natural resource sector and elsewhere where presidential action has not been forthcoming. And if action at the very highest echelons of the political authority are not forthcoming, it's very difficult then to hold actors below that level to the high standards that Dr. Sai believes we need to hold them to. You need to set the tone at the top.
All right. Thank you very much, Bright Simmons. We take a break here. When we return, we are going to the Auditor General and to Speaker of Parliament, because he has transmitted his audit report to the Speaker of Parliament. We find out how we are going to recover in excess of 10 billion and so on. We'll be right back.